Good morning! Hello, welcome everyone. It is day 2 of this little project I'm doing of answering questions that I've gotten from a lot of people. I feel like my wisdom will go to waste if I don't share it with all of you. And it's a lot easier for me to talk than write. I do a lot of writing, but, but I do a lot of talking. So, so today I'm going to be talking about a subject that I think I've gotten quite a bit of questions about in my past and recently, which is the difference between doing B2B and B2C research. For those of you who don't live in the world of a million tech acronyms, B2B means business to business and B2C means business to consumer. So most tech companies fall in one of these categories, but the line is definitely blurry. So a good example would be like accounting software. You can use an accounting software as a, you just in your life, to manage your finances like with your family. Or you can use software in your business to manage your business expenses, taxes, all that fun stuff. So that would be something that's sort of on the line. And even within those categories of B2C and B2B, there are differences, there are a range. B2B, for example, is probably what I'll talk the most about today because I think it's the area that user research and UX tends to neglect publicly. Things like consumer stuff are sexier for whatever reason. Essentially, I think we can relate to them more on a day-to-day basis. Like you're using things on your phone all the time. You're using things on your computer all the time. Facebook and Instagram and games, all those kind of things are B2B, B2C stuff. And it's very fun to think about reaching consumers like in your everyday life and solving their problems. Whereas B2B stuff is a little more complicated, which is why we're going to talk about some of the differences in doing research with them. In terms of my career, I actually would say that I am much more of a B2B specialist than I am a B2C person. For whatever reason, I really like the complexity of B2B problems. So, I've worked in like in-house on enterprise software. I've also have clients that are B2B. For example, one of my clients right now, I still have a few UX research clients. One of them is a B2B company in real estate and pretty classic stuff, really early stage startup. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum you have Salesforce, where I worked. I ran research for the industry group, and we sold B2B software to companies in specific industry verticals. In particular, when I was there, I worked on the health product, which had just launched, and the financial services product, which had also just launched. So financial service cloud, health cloud, those were mine. I also worked on the launch, essentially the very early stage research of their retail product, Trifacta, where I ran research for a couple years after that. Also a very, very classic B2B company, very enterprise sales. So let's talk about one of the big things that makes research in enterprise software very interesting. Unlike consumer software, you often are not actually selling to the people who are going to be buying or actually using your software on a day-to-day basis. So particularly when you're selling to bigger companies, there will often be a big, long sales process where you're, say, dealing with an executive or a head of a department, a CIO, and these deals, depending on the company, could be multi-million dollar, $50 million deals. I mean, that's big, but those exist. So unsurprisingly, the sales process is very long, it's complicated, and what is interesting is that almost never are the people, these CIOs and CTOs and managers of the product department, these people very rarely are the ones using your software. So what ends up happening, and I've seen this happen a bunch, is that particularly if you're a growing company and you don't know who your users are fully yet and you haven't really articulated it, you end up building for the people you're selling to. So A CIO has a very different set of requirements than, say, a data analyst. If the data analyst is the one using the software, the data analyst is the one who's going to obviously have the feedback about, you know, the usability and how pleasurable or not pleasurable it is to use. Whereas the CIO is going to be caring about things like security and cost and, you know, can this connect with all of my other technology? Inevitably, I have a ton. So particularly in these B2B processes, you have to be really thoughtful about whether or not you're building to sell the software or you're building to actually have it used. You ideally hit both goals, but given that software you know, takes time to develop, it takes resources, usually you're preferring one over the other. So this means, at least the common problem that I have seen is that people build for the sales process, but then once you know, they start rolling out the technology to the rest of the company, the actual users, they have adoption problems. And that's because they built to sell, which you do need to do. But I think there are other ways that you can actually sell to people and not like build a bunch of stuff that no one wants. Because as it turns out, a lot of the CIOs or, you know, the people buying these software don't necessarily know what it's like on a day-to-day basis to use the product that you're trying to build. So, so one of the things you want to do is be very clear when you're thinking about doing research is, who am I doing research with? Am I doing research with someone who is a buyer or someone involved in the buying process, say like the IT department usually has to sign off on everything? Or are you actually you know, doing research with users, like people who get very hands-on and would be using your product all the time? The common mistake is to do most of your research with the buyers or the people involved in the buying process, if for no other reason the access to them is usually easier. So now we talk about B2B sales. So usually the way it works is you will have an actual sales team selling B2B software. Not everywhere. This is, once again, not universal, but you will have salespeople and they will have a certain number of accounts that they sell to, or usually based on region. And essentially, they will be managing the entire process until, you know, a contract is signed. Then it will go over to a post-sales team, which has different names depending on the company. It could be customer success, it could be support, it could be, oh, I don't know. There are probably a bunch of other post-sales organizations. But suffice it to say, that's when the company starts engaging. And depending on the complexity of the software, depending on the complexity of the rollout, you might not actually have end users for a full year and a half since, you know, they started the buying process, potentially even longer depending on the organization. Like, think big banks, they move slowly. I can tell you, like, I've seen like a big bank buy a piece of software and not have their first user until year and a half, 2 years later. So until then, oftentimes companies haven't even talked to users. They haven't even talked to people who are going to get hands-on with the software. And interestingly, because the buyers are sort of the point of contact and the people that your team has been interacting with, you often don't even have names or email addresses for these users. So there's some like mysterious entity off in the ether that you haven't even talked to. So when you're doing B2B research, you have to be very, very thoughtful and crisp about who you're actually who's actually going to be using your product, and actually find them, not just the buyers and the sellers. You want feedback from everyone, to be fair, but particularly if you're worried about adoption and retention and renewals, you really need to do research with the end users. So to do that, I have seen the range of things where people have direct access to users. Like in an early stage startup, you're probably going to have direct access even to the users because you don't have a sales team. It might just be the CEO running everything. That's easier. For example, I'm doing research right now for this real estate company, and the CEO is the one doing all the selling. You know, he manages customer success, so essentially he can make introductions to users for me. On the other side, when you're working with big companies and who have lots of infrastructure and a lot of sales processes, you have to go through multiple layers to access actual users. So, for example, when I was at Salesforce, I had to first, you know, build relationships with our sales team, and then we had to I had to get introductions to the appropriate customer success person. Then I could maybe start getting access to users. But what's interesting is that in a lot of B2B products, they'll actually hand out licenses themselves, which means you have no way of tracking who your users are. Often they also have analytics that are like behind a firewall or don't even exist. So it's not like you can, you know, mine your analytics to find users. So it is very challenging to find users in B2B research. I'm giving you all of this because I feel like it isn't really discussed, and knowing some of the pitfalls you're going to run into is really important. So what can you do with B2B research? So one of my favorite things to do is essentially to recruit people who use either similar software or have similar problems. For example, when I was at Trifecta, our users were a combination of like data analysts and data engineers, and there are competitors out in the market already. People have problems and have solved them, sometimes with Excel, sometimes with something more fancy. So I went out and recruited people who would in fact be doing the same tasks. They might not be using Trifecta right now, but particularly for things like understanding motivations, understanding goals, understanding beliefs, you don't need them to actually be a current user of your product. You just need them to essentially match the profile of a potential user. So that's a really good trick to go out and do it. Otherwise, you're going to be doing a lot of relationship building within your company with customer success and sales. And I think one of the most important things to do is make it worth their while too. So I would always have, like at Trifecta, I always had the head of sales invited to any research share outs that I did. In fact, usually the entire executive team got invited, but that's a whole separate discussion. But someone in sales would hear it, and then they could apply my research to their sales process. A good example is like, what kind of things do you know, data analysts really struggle with? That is something that I could tell you from the research I did. That is also something that the sales team can then speak to and sell. Similarly with customer success, actually one of my biggest advocates at Trifecta was a member of the customer success team because he was responsible for training. So what do people struggle with? What do they need training on? By providing him with research that would help him address this, he got something out of it too. So think of ways you can actually internally meet the needs of you know, the stakeholders who are the gatekeepers to your users. You also want to make sure that they know that you're not going to do anything to jeopardize, you know, a renewal or a sales process. So the more you can show that users actually love talking to you and love engaging with you, then the better off you are. Let's see, what else can I say about B2B research? You are certainly likely to engage with different sort of archetypes. I would say in B2B ecosystems, it's rare for me to see like one or two, you know, very clear types of users. I'm trying to use a different language, but there's no better way to say user because people, humans is too broad, and anyway. So essentially you really need to be honest with yourself about, you know, what types of stakeholders are going to be involved in the sort of workflow and process once you're doing your research. Even if someone might not be hands-on with the software, if they're in one of the touch points, you need to understand them as well. So like IT is often involved in a lot of things. So if they are there procuring, essentially like handing out licenses, if they are you know, setting up an environment, if they are essentially tracking, you know, data so that you can audit it correctly. Though that means even if they're not using the software, they're involved in the process, so you want to understand what their deal is. Let's see, what else can I tell you about B2B research in particular? Users will end up being a fan. So I think one of the other things you can do sort of more ground up stuff and try to recruit, say, on forums. Like if you're trying to build a community around your product, that's another way to recruit users. So I often, in terms of recruiting, particularly in B2B, end up having like a hybrid approach. It's never like I just get to recruit from one place. It's usually a combination of like recruiting people who are not users now, recruiting users who are enthusiastic. So those are ones who are likely engaging on your forum, but they're going to have a particularly skewed perspective because they are in fact enthusiasts. And then also getting introductions through sales and customer success. So there are these like three groups. And as you build your community, if you're someone who's very successful, recruiting from the like enthusiasts and, you know, people who are engaging with you already is a really good thing to do. Oh, another thing you can do is look at support tickets. Most companies, particularly B2B companies, are going to have some sort of support ticketing system that either your tech support or your customer success team is going to be managing. You can go into that and essentially see what problems people are having and reach out to them with permission from your customer success team. I think I covered a good chunk of that, which means now we can go and talk about the difference with B2C research. B2C research, in my opinion, is easier. That's probably why I went and did B2B, because I'm a glutton for punishment. B2C research, you're much more likely to have direct access to users. So if, for example, someone signs up for your product with their email address, assuming your terms of service allows it, you can probably reach out to them. You can probably recruit from them. Whether or not you have enough information to, say, segment the population, whole separate question. Probably something you work with your marketing team on, in fact. You can also look at analytics typically more closely and, say, recruit people who are exhibiting certain behaviors within your app. And nowadays, there are even tools to do it within the app, so you don't have to like look at the analytics and generate a list of email addresses, though you can do that. You also can, you know, once they complete a specific, say, task or workflow, like after they take my training, I will then ask them questions. You can pop something up. I think there are a bunch of tools for this now. I think Full Story might be one of them. Neo, I think, I don't know how to pronounce it, but there are a bunch of tools out there that will help you with this. Obviously, you need to work with your engineering team to implement them. That's another really good way to recruit. Similarly, if you have a community, you can recruit from that. If you have a Facebook group or LinkedIn group or anything like that, that's a good way to think about it. The nice thing about consumer research is you also tend to have more people, not always, it depends on the company, but on the whole, I would say the numbers tend to be much bigger, or potentially much bigger. One of the things you just have to pay attention to is, you know, what sort of category do these users fall into. One of the things I will typically do is essentially segment them based on like their level of engagement and activity, and what engagement counts, you know, is going to differ depending on a company. I worked with a fairly prominent news app earlier this year, and you know, they have like 10 million users a day. So there was certainly much more ability to segment than like when you have like 50 users, in which case if you have 50 users, you just talk to all of them. If you have 10 million users, you can be like, all right, what are the things I care about? Do I care about getting new users, or am I really concerned about increasing activity and engagement within my product of people who are already there? This is going to sort of determine who you talk to, how you talk to them. It's nice because you can be much more nuanced when making these decisions. Where I've found in B2B research, you are much more likely to have to take what you can get and then sort of do almost like post-segmentation, which is why oftentimes when I'm doing B2B research, it will sort of be iterative, and I will do like one round with people that I'm able to recruit, and the people I've been referred to me by the stakeholders, then we'll sort of map and say, all right, is this a really active user? Is this someone who's new to the software? And this all depends, once again, on the company. And then you fill in the gaps. So essentially, after that first round, you might notice, oh, I don't have anyone outside the US, so I'll go and talk to some people outside of the US. So that's some of the approaches. I realized I talked mostly about recruiting today, so I'm gonna retitle this video, and I might do a part 2 on enterprise versus B2C because there's so much I can say. But this is mostly about recruiting and getting access to users. So I will talk probably a little bit more about the kind of conclusions you're likely to draw, the kind of things you can say, the kind of questions people are likely to ask as a difference as well. So stay tuned for part 2, which will probably be tomorrow. Yay!